Right now, you're probably thinking life is pretty tough. Maybe you're stressed about work, worried about money, dealing with relationship drama. Maybe you're doom scrolling through news about climate change, political chaos, or the latest global crisis. You might even think you're living through the worst time in human history. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. There was a time when being human meant watching 9 out of 10 of your children die before their 5th birthday. When a simple cut on your finger could kill you within a week. When winter wasn't just cold, it was a death sentence for entire communities. When most humans never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born, and if they did, they probably died trying. I'm talking about the 14th century. And if you think 2025 is rough, let me tell you about 1348. That was the year the Black Death arrived in Europe. But calling it just a disease outbreak is like calling World War II a minor disagreement. This wasn't a pandemic. This was the apocalypse with a medical degree. Picture this. You're living in London in 1348. The city has maybe 100,000 people packed into an area smaller than most modern shopping malls. There's no running water, no sewage system, no understanding of germs or hygiene. People throw their waste out windows into streets that are basically open sewers. The Thames isn't the scenic river you see today. It's a toxic brown sludge filled with human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from tanneries and butchers. The smell is so overwhelming that wealthy people carry pomanders filled with herbs and spices just to breathe without vomiting. Houses are built with timber and thatch, packed so tightly together that you can reach out your window and shake hands with your neighbor. Fire is a constant threat because entire city blocks can go up in flames from a single cooking accident. But fire is also the only source of heat and light, so every home is basically a tinderbox with an open flame burning inside it. Most people live their entire lives in a single room shared with extended family, livestock, and whatever vermin have taken up residence. Privacy doesn't exist. Personal space doesn't exist. The concept of hygiene is so foreign that bathing is actually considered dangerous because people think it opens your pores to disease. Then ships start arriving from the east. Ships carrying something that will kill half of Europe in just 5 years. The plague didn't just kill people, it erased them. Entire villages vanished. Family lines that had existed for centuries ended in weeks. Cities that had been centers of trade and culture became ghost towns where grass grew through the cobblestones. But here's what really made the 14th century the absolute worst time to be human. It wasn't just the plague. The plague was just the final catastrophe in a century of disasters that had been building for decades. Let me paint you the full picture of what hell on earth actually looked like. It starts in 1315 with something historians call the Great Famine. For 3 years straight, it rained. Not normal rain, apocalyptic, biblical, civilization-ending rain. The kind of rain that makes you understand why every ancient culture has flood myths. Picture this. You're a peasant farmer in northern France. Your entire existence depends on growing enough grain to feed your family and pay your feudal obligations. You've spent months preparing your fields, planting seeds, tending crops. Then it starts raining in April and doesn't stop until November. At first, you think it's just a bad season. Farmers deal with weather problems all the time, but this isn't weather. This is a fundamental shift in climate patterns that will persist for centuries. The warm period that had allowed European agriculture to flourish for 300 years is ending. The Little Ice Age is beginning. Your crops don't just fail, they rot in the fields. Grain that could have fed hundreds of families becomes black, mouldy sludge. The few crops that survive to harvest are so waterlogged they're inedible. Seeds saved for next year's planting have turned to mush. But it's not just your farm. It's every farm, from Ireland to Hungary, from Scotland to Italy. Agricultural systems that had supported millions of people simply collapse. Grain prices don't just increase, they explode. In some regions, wheat costs 800% more than it did before the famine. That's like gas suddenly costing $25 per gallon. Except unlike gas, you can't choose not to buy grain. You either eat or you die. So people start eating things that aren't food. Tree bark ground into a paste, grass soup, leather boiled until it's soft enough to swallow. In Flanders, contemporary chronicles record people eating horse dung because they thought it might contain undigested grain. When those options run out, people start eating each other, not metaphorically, literally. The historical records from this period contain detailed accounts of cannibalism across Europe, parents eating dead children, people ambushing travelers to murder them for food, markets where human flesh was sold alongside whatever animal meat could be found. A chronicler in Ireland wrote, "People devoured each other without mercy. The poor ate their own children, and mothers ate the flesh of their own daughters." This wasn't isolated incidents. This was systematic. When all other food sources disappear and you're watching your family starve to death, moral boundaries that seem absolute in normal times become meaningless. Imagine making that choice. Imagine looking at your dead child and deciding whether to bury them or eat them. Imagine that being a rational decision because the alternative is watching your surviving children die too. The Great Famine killed about 10% of Europe's population. In some regions, the death toll reached 25%. But the survivors weren't lucky. They were just alive to face what came next. The climate shift that caused the famine didn't end when the rains stopped. Earth had entered what scientists now call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that would last until the 19th century. Summers became shorter and colder. Winters stretched on for months longer than normal. Growing seasons shrank by weeks each year. Even when the acute famine ended, food remained scarce and expensive. Malnutrition became chronic across Europe. People were constantly hungry, constantly weakened, constantly on the edge of starvation. Birth rates plummeted because malnourished women couldn't sustain pregnancies. Death rates soared because hungry people couldn't fight off diseases. But malnutrition was just one part of the disaster. The famine had broken down social structures that had kept medieval society functioning. Feudalism depended on agricultural surplus. Peasants grew food, gave a portion to their feudal lords, and kept enough to survive. Lords used their share to support armies, maintain infrastructure, and fund the complex social systems that kept order. When agriculture collapsed, the entire system collapsed with it. Peasants who couldn't pay their feudal obligations were evicted from their land. But there was nowhere to go because every region was experiencing the same crisis. Masses of displaced people roamed the countryside, scavenging for food, turning to banditry, dying by the roadside. Lords who couldn't collect agricultural rents couldn't pay their armies. Professional soldiers who hadn't been paid became mercenary bands that lived by pillaging. The very people who were supposed to maintain order became threats to survival. Trade networks that had connected Europe to the rest of the world broke down because there wasn't enough surplus production to support commerce. Cities that depended on trade shrank as merchants fled or went bankrupt. The money economy that had been developing since the 12th century partially collapsed as people reverted to barter systems. Knowledge systems failed too. Monasteries, which preserved most of Europe's literacy and learning, couldn't support their monks when agricultural donations stopped coming. Many monasteries were abandoned. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were left to decay or were destroyed by desperate people looking for anything combustible to burn for warmth. This is the world the Black Death entered in 1347. A population weakened by decades of malnutrition, social systems that had already partially collapsed, economic networks that were barely functioning, People who had spent their entire lives dealing with one crisis after another. They weren't prepared for what came next. Nobody could have been. The plague arrived in October 1347 in the port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea. Mongol armies had been besieging the city for years. According to contemporary accounts, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls as a form of biological warfare. Whether this actually happened or not, the plague was definitely present in the Mongol army. When Genoese merchants fled Kaffa and sailed back to Europe, they carried the plague with them. The ships that docked in Constantinople, Messina, and other Mediterranean ports were floating morgues. Sailors were dead or dying. Cargo holds were full of corpses, but the goods were valuable, and desperate port authorities allowed the ships to dock and unload their cargo. Along with silk and spices from Asia, they unloaded rats infected with plague-carrying fleas. The rats spread through European cities like an invading army, and wherever they went, they brought death. The Black Death wasn't one disease, it was 3 different manifestations of the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis. Each had its own method of killing you, but they all worked fast. Bubonic plague was the most common form. You'd start feeling sick with what seemed like a normal fever. Then the buboes would appear. Massive swellings in your lymph nodes, usually in your armpits, groin, and neck. They'd grow rapidly, sometimes reaching the size of apples within hours. The pain was indescribable. Contemporary accounts describe people screaming continuously because the pressure inside the buboes was so intense. The swellings would turn black as the tissue died. Eventually, they'd burst, releasing torrents of blood and pus. If you were lucky, you'd die within a week. If you were unlucky, you'd linger for weeks, conscious and in agony while your body rotted around you. Pneumonic plague was worse because it spread through the air. You could catch it just by breathing near someone who was infected. It attacked your lungs directly, causing you to cough up blood and tissue. Your lungs would literally dissolve, drowning you from the inside while you remained conscious. Death came in 2 to 3 days, but those days were spent in constant agony, unable to breathe, coughing up pieces of your own lungs while blood poured from your mouth and nose. Septicemic plague was the fastest but perhaps most terrifying. The bacteria entered your bloodstream directly and multiplied so rapidly that your blood became toxic. You'd develop dark spots all over your skin as blood vessels burst. Your fingers and toes would turn black and fall off. Your blood would literally poison you. Most people died within 24 hours, often before they even knew they were sick. You could wake up feeling fine and be dead before sunset. The mortality rate varied by location, but overall, the plague killed between 50 and 60% of Europe's population. In some cities, it reached 90%. Venice lost 3/4 of its population, Paris lost half. Florence went from 100,000 people to 50,000 in 6 months. In England, entire villages were abandoned. You can still see their ruins today, 700 years later. Ghost towns where grass grows through the foundations of churches and houses, the only remaining evidence that people once lived, worked, and died there. But the raw numbers don't capture the true horror of what it was like to live through this. Imagine waking up and finding your family dead. Not one person, all of them. Your spouse, your children, your parents, your siblings, all dead in the same night. Their bodies already starting to decompose in the heat. Imagine walking through streets lined with corpses because there weren't enough living people to bury the dead. Bodies piled in carts like firewood, taken to massive pits outside the city where they were dumped in layers and covered with lime. Imagine the smell, thousands of rotting corpses in the summer heat, the sweet, cloying odor of decomposition that clings to your clothes and hair, that you taste in your food and smell in your dreams. People stopped trying to maintain civilization. Why work when you'll probably be dead next week? Why plant crops when there might not be anyone alive to harvest them? Why follow laws when the authorities are all dying too? Why maintain relationships when everyone you care about will likely be dead soon? Contemporary accounts describe the complete breakdown of social order. People abandoned their children, leaving babies to die alone while they fled in terror. Parents deserted sick kids rather than risk infection. Husbands abandoned wives. The basic human bonds that hold society together just disintegrated. In Siena, Italy, a chronicler named Agnolo di Tura wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship." Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Think about that. No funerals, no last rites, no goodbye. People were dumping their loved ones in mass graves like garbage because that was the only option. The rituals that had given meaning to death for centuries simply disappeared because there wasn't time for them and there weren't enough people left alive to perform them. Religious faith, which had been the foundation of medieval life, crumbled. People prayed constantly and watched everyone die anyway. They made pilgrimages to holy sites and caught the plague from other pilgrims. They donated everything they owned to the church and died in poverty while priests fled to avoid infection. The clergy, who were supposed to provide spiritual comfort during the crisis, died at rates even higher than the general population. They lived in close quarters in monasteries. They visited the sick to administer last rites. They gathered people together for religious services. All of these behaviors spread the plague faster. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Cathedrals stood empty because all the priests were dead. People died without receiving the sacraments that medieval Christianity considered essential for salvation. The spiritual framework that had given meaning to suffering no longer provided any answers. Some turned to extreme religious practices, like the flagellants, who whipped themselves bloody in public processions, thinking that physical suffering would convince God to end the plague. They marched from town to town, stripping naked and beating themselves with leather whips embedded with metal studs until their backs were raw meat. These processions sometimes turned violent. Flagellants would attack Jews, blaming them for the plague. They'd destroy property, claiming they were purifying the world of sin. Local authorities, when they still existed, often tried to ban flagellant processions because they spread both disease and social disorder. Others decided that if God wasn't listening, maybe the devil was, leading to an explosion of occult practices, witchcraft accusations, and desperate attempts to find supernatural solutions to earthly problems. But perhaps the most devastating aspect was the complete breakdown of knowledge and learning. Medieval Europe had been experiencing a renaissance of sorts in the 12th and 13th centuries. Universities had been founded in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and other cities. Trade networks connected Europe to Asia, bringing new ideas along with new goods. Art and architecture were advancing. Scientific knowledge was slowly accumulating. The plague destroyed all of it. Monasteries, which were the centers of learning and literacy, were decimated. Monks lived in close quarters and cared for the sick, so they died at higher rates than the general population. Entire libraries of irreplaceable manuscripts were lost when monasteries were abandoned or when desperate people burned books for fuel. The University of Paris, which had been one of the great centers of learning in Europe, lost most of its faculty and students. The few scholars who survived often had no students to teach because young people had died in disproportionate numbers. Technological knowledge was passed down through guilds of craftsmen. Master craftsmen would teach apprentices over years or decades, slowly transferring complex skills from one generation to the next. But when the master craftsmen died, their secrets died with them. Entire industries collapsed. The techniques for making certain types of cloth, for working with particular metals, for building specific architectural elements were simply forgotten. Some of these skills wouldn't be rediscovered for generations. Europe went backward. Techniques for building, farming, and manufacturing that had been developed over centuries were lost in just a few years of plague. It would take hundreds of years to rediscover what had been lost, and this is where the 14th century becomes truly nightmarish. It wasn't just about dying. It was about watching human civilization collapse in real time and knowing that nobody knew how to stop it or fix it. Trade routes that had connected Europe to the rest of the world broke down when there weren't enough merchants left alive to maintain them. The Silk Road, which had brought Asian goods to European markets for centuries, essentially ceased to function in many regions. Cities that had been centres of commerce became ghost towns. Bruges, which had been one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, lost so many people that entire districts were abandoned. Grass grew in the marketplaces. Houses collapsed from neglect. Agricultural systems that had fed millions failed when there weren't enough farmers left to work the land. Fields that had been cultivated for generations returned to wilderness. Irrigation systems built over centuries fell into disrepair. The economic system collapsed. Currency became worthless when there wasn't enough economic activity to support it. People reverted to barter systems that hadn't been seen since the early Middle Ages. Some regions essentially returned to subsistence economies. Legal systems failed when there weren't enough judges, lawyers, or law enforcement officers left alive. Property rights became meaningless when entire families died out and there was no one to inherit. Contracts became unenforceable when the parties to them were dead. Criminal justice broke down when there weren't enough people to staff courts or prisons. Some criminals simply died of plague before they could be tried. Others escaped during the chaos and were never recaptured. Even basic infrastructure crumbled. Roads went unrepaired when there weren't enough people to maintain them or pay taxes to fund maintenance. Bridges collapsed, harbours silted up. The physical framework that supported civilization simply fell apart. Water systems failed. The aqueducts and cisterns that supplied cities with clean water were no longer maintained. Wells became contaminated. People were forced to drink from the same sources they used for waste disposal. Sanitation, which had never been good, became non-existent. With no organised waste disposal and no one to clean streets, cities became breeding grounds for disease. The plague was just the beginning. Dysentery, typhus, and other diseases spread through populations weakened by malnutrition and exposure. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. People living through it didn't understand what was happening. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses. They didn't know the plague was spread by fleas on rats. They thought it was caused by bad air or unusual planetary alignments or God's wrath against human sinfulness. The prevailing medical theory was based on the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that disease was caused by imbalances in these humours and that treatment involved restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, and other methods that actually made patients worse. So their attempts to fight the plague were not just useless, but often made things worse. They thought the disease spread through smell, so they carried flowers or herbs to ward it off. This did nothing to protect them from flea bites. They thought bloodletting would balance their humours, so doctors literally drained sick people of blood, weakening them further when they needed all their strength to fight the infection. They thought bathing was dangerous because it opened your pores to disease, so they avoided washing. This helped spread plague and other infections. The most popular medical treatments were completely ineffective. Doctors recommended drinking ground unicorn horn mixed with wine. Others suggested eating crushed emeralds or powdered pearls. Some prescribed sitting in sewers because they believed the bad air would drive out the worse air of the plague. Imagine being desperately sick and having someone press a live chicken against your infected lymph nodes because that's the best medical science available. Or being bled with dirty instruments because doctors think removing blood will cure you. The few physicians who existed were dying as fast as their patients. Medical schools had been devastated by the plague. Most regions had no trained doctors at all. People relied on folk remedies, superstition and prayer. But even if medical knowledge had been advanced, it wouldn't have mattered much because the infrastructure to support medical care had collapsed. Hospitals, which were run by religious orders, were overwhelmed or abandoned when all the monks and nuns died. There were no supply chains to distribute medicines, no communication networks to share information about treatments, no organized response to the crisis. Each community faced the plague alone, with whatever local resources they could muster. This is what made the 14th century uniquely horrible. It wasn't just that people were dying. It's that they were dying while watching everything that made life bearable disappear around them, and they had no understanding of why it was happening or how to stop it. Let's talk about what daily life was actually like for an ordinary person trying to survive this nightmare. You wake up in a one-room house that you share with your family, your animals, and whatever relatives are still alive. The house is made of timber and thatch, which provides minimal protection from cold, rain, or disease-carrying vermin. There's no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters that you keep closed to keep out the bad air that everyone thinks causes plague. This means your house is dark most of the time, lit only by candles or oil lamps that produce more smoke than light. The floor is dirt covered with straw that's changed infrequently. It's full of fleas, lice, and other parasites. Your bed is a straw mattress that you share with multiple family members, assuming they're still alive. The first thing you do each morning is check if everyone in your family is still breathing. Maybe your youngest child developed a fever during the night. Maybe your spouse is coughing blood. Maybe you've woken up to find someone dead beside you, their body already stiffening in the cold. If everyone's still alive, you face the daily challenge of finding food. The local markets might be closed because the merchants are dead or have fled to the countryside. The farms that used to supply your town might be abandoned, the farmers either dead or too sick to work. Even if food is available, it costs many times what it used to. A loaf of bread might cost a week's wages. Meat is a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even they can't always find it. Most people survive on thin gruel made from whatever grain can be found, supplemented by vegetables when available. You might have a small garden, but the climate has become cold and unpredictable. The growing techniques your father taught you don't work anymore because the weather patterns have changed. You're constantly hungry, weakened by malnutrition, which makes you more susceptible to disease. Water is a constant problem. Wells might be contaminated with runoff from cemeteries where plague victims are buried. Rivers and streams are polluted with waste from upstream communities. Boiling water isn't understood as a method of purification, so waterborne diseases are common. If you need to travel anywhere, every journey is potentially fatal, not just because you might encounter the plague in other towns, but because the roads are dangerous. With legal authority collapsed, bandits and mercenary companies roam freely, robbing and murdering travelers. Local lords, desperate to maintain their power and wealth, might have turned to brigandage themselves. The same people who once protected travelers now prey on them. Even staying home isn't safe. Your neighbors, driven desperate by hunger and fear, might decide to steal your food or kill you for your possessions. People you've known your entire life, who you considered friends, might become threats when survival is at stake. The social bonds that normally keep communities functioning have broken down. Trust, which is essential for any society, has largely disappeared. Everyone is a potential threat because everyone is desperate, and hanging over everything is the constant grinding fear. Fear that you'll wake up with symptoms, fear that your children will die, fear that your community will be wiped out, fear that the world is actually ending and you're watching the final chapter of human history. This wasn't temporary anxiety about a crisis that would pass. People in the 14th century lived with the reasonable belief that humanity might not survive. They had watched their world shrink from a growing, connected civilization to isolated pockets of survivors clinging to existence. The psychological trauma was unimaginable. Survivors often described a kind of emotional numbness, a protective mechanism that allowed them to function despite constant horror. They'd seen so much death and suffering that they stopped feeling grief. They'd lost so many people that they stopped forming attachments. Contemporary chronicle accounts describe people wandering aimlessly, unable to make decisions or plan for the future. Why plant crops when the plague might kill everyone before harvest? Why repair your house when you might be dead next month? Why have children when they'll probably die in infancy? Some historians argue that the demographic crisis created by the Black Death led to the first recorded instances of what we now recognize as widespread depression and anxiety disorders. Entire populations showed symptoms of what modern psychology would diagnose as post-traumatic stress. But they couldn't treat it because psychology didn't exist as a field of study. They couldn't even properly describe their mental suffering because they lacked the vocabulary and conceptual framework to understand what was happening to them emotionally. Instead, they turned to alcohol when it was available, religious extremism, or simple despair. Suicide rates increased dramatically. Some people deliberately exposed themselves to plague because dying quickly seemed preferable to enduring the prolonged agony of survival. The alcohol that was available was often contaminated or poorly made. Beer and wine were safer to drink than water in many places, but the brewing and winemaking industries had been disrupted by the crisis. What alcohol existed was often weak, expensive, or dangerous to consume. Religious responses became increasingly extreme and desperate. People engaged in self-flagellation, believing that physical suffering would appease God's anger. Others became convinced that the end times had arrived and that normal moral rules no longer applied. Some communities turned to scapegoating, blaming specific groups for the disaster. Jews were frequently targeted, accused of poisoning wells or causing the plague through supernatural means. Entire Jewish communities were massacred by mobs looking for someone to blame for their suffering. These pogroms were often encouraged by local authorities who saw them as a way to distract people from their failures to address the crisis. Killing Jews didn't solve any problems, but it gave people a sense that they were doing something, fighting back against forces they couldn't understand. Women, especially elderly women, were also targeted as scapegoats. Accusations of witchcraft increased dramatically during the crisis years. Women who had knowledge of herbal medicine, who lived alone, or who simply acted differently were accused of causing the plague through supernatural means. The witch trials that became common in later centuries had their roots in the desperate scapegoating that occurred during the 14th century crisis. People needed someone to blame, and women without male protection were easy targets. Now, you might think that once the plague ended, things got better. You'd be wrong. The Black Death killed so many people so quickly that it destabilized European society for generations. The survivors inherited a world that was simultaneously empty and chaotic. Agricultural systems had to be completely rebuilt. There weren't enough farmers left to work the land, but there also wasn't enough demand for food because there weren't enough people left to feed. Some regions experienced famine even after the plague ended because they'd lost the knowledge of how to farm efficiently. The demographic collapse meant that vast areas of previously cultivated land were abandoned. Without constant maintenance, fields reverted to wilderness. Drainage systems that had taken generations to build filled with silt and became swamps. The labor shortage created massive social upheaval. Peasants who had survived could demand higher wages because they were scarce. This terrified the nobility, who saw it as a threat to the social order. They responded with new laws trying to keep peasants in their traditional roles and limit wage increases. These laws were largely unenforceable because there weren't enough authorities left to enforce them, but they created resentment and social tension. The result was a series of peasant rebellions that lasted for decades and sometimes turned extremely violent. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 saw mobs of angry survivors marching on London, killing government officials and demanding an end to serfdom. They burned manor houses, destroyed legal records, and executed anyone they associated with oppression. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe. In France, the Jacquerie Rebellion saw peasants torturing and killing nobles and their families. In Flanders, workers' revolts destroyed entire cities. The traditional feudal system that had structured society for centuries was collapsing, and nobody knew what would replace it. Religious authority was permanently damaged. The Catholic Church had promised that faith and prayer would protect people from the plague. When half the population died anyway, many people lost trust in religious institutions entirely. The Church's moral authority was also undermined by the behavior of many clergy during the crisis. Some priests had fled their parishes to avoid infection, abandoning their congregations in their hour of greatest need. Others had demanded payment for performing last rites or other sacraments. This led to the rise of new religious movements, many of which the Church condemned as heretical. People began questioning fundamental doctrines, reading the Bible for themselves, and developing their own interpretations of Christianity. Some of these movements turned violent. The flagellant movement I mentioned earlier sometimes evolved into anti-clerical riots, with mobs attacking churches and killing priests. Other movements became apocalyptic cults that believed the end of the world was imminent. The breakdown of international trade networks had long-term consequences that lasted for centuries. Goods that had been readily available before the plague became rare luxuries. Spices from Asia, silk, precious metals, all became much more expensive and difficult to obtain. Technologies that depended on international exchange of knowledge stagnated. The Islamic world, which had been a major source of scientific and mathematical knowledge for medieval Europe, became more isolated. Byzantine Empire, already weakened, lost much of its population and never fully recovered. Some regions never fully recovered from the demographic collapse. Parts of rural England and France remained depopulated for centuries after the plague. Villages that were abandoned during the crisis were never resettled. Agricultural land that had fed thousands returned to forest. Roads and infrastructure that had connected these regions fell into permanent disrepair. Trade routes that had been used for centuries were abandoned. The physical network that had supported medieval civilization simply disappeared in many areas. But perhaps most importantly, the psychological trauma created by the 14th century crisis fundamentally changed European culture in ways that lasted for centuries. The period before the Black Death had been characterized by what historians call medieval optimism. Despite the hardships of medieval life, people generally believed that society was progressing, that human knowledge was advancing, that God's plan for the world was fundamentally good. The Gothic cathedrals built in the 12th and 13th centuries reflected this optimism. They were massive projects that took decades or centuries to complete, representing faith in the future and belief in human capability. The literature of the period celebrated heroic ideals and courtly virtues. After the plague, European culture became obsessed with death and the fragility of human existence. Art from the late 14th and 15th centuries is filled with images of skeletons, corpses, and decay. The dance of death became a popular artistic motif, showing death as an equalizer who comes for everyone regardless of social status. Literature became darker and more pessimistic. The heroic romances of the 13th century gave way to works that focused on human weakness and the inevitability of suffering. Even comedy became more bitter and satirical, focusing on the foolishness and corruption of human institutions. Architecture reflected this change too. The soaring optimism of Gothic cathedrals was replaced by more defensive, fortress-like structures. Churches built after the plague were often smaller and more austere, reflecting reduced resources and diminished faith. This cultural transformation had lasting effects that shaped European development for centuries. Some historians argue that the Renaissance humanist movement was partially a reaction to the trauma of the 14th century, an attempt to restore faith in human dignity and potential after a period when human civilization had nearly collapsed. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement, on human creativity and potential, can be seen as a response to the medieval period's demonstration of human fragility and mortality. The humanists were trying to rebuild confidence in human capabilities that had been shattered by the 14th century crisis. Others suggest that the Protestant Reformation was influenced by the religious crisis created by the plague years. The Catholic Church's failure to protect people from disaster, combined with corruption and incompetence demonstrated during the crisis, created an opening for alternative forms of Christianity. Martin Luther's emphasis on individual relationship with God rather than dependence on church hierarchy resonated with people whose trust in religious institutions had been broken by the 14th century experience. But let's zoom back to what it actually meant for individuals trying to survive this period and rebuild afterward. If you were born in 1340, your entire life would have been shaped by crisis and recovery. You would have lived through the Great Famine as a child, watching your world descend into the Little Ice Age, experiencing the breakdown of social order, surviving the Black Death as a teenager, and then spending your adult years trying to rebuild civilization from scratch. Your life expectancy would have been maybe 35 years if you were extremely lucky. Most people died much younger. You would have been hungry most of the time, dealing with chronic malnutrition that stunted your growth and weakened your immune system. You would have lost most of your family members to disease, violence, or starvation. The nuclear family structure that we take for granted barely existed because so few people lived long enough to maintain stable relationships across generations. You would have had little formal education. Most schools had closed during the crisis years. The few that reopened had limited resources and often unqualified teachers. Literacy rates, which had been slowly increasing in the 12th and 13th centuries, plummeted and didn't recover for generations. You would have had little security and little reason to hope that things would get better. The concept of progress, of society improving over time, had been shattered by the experience of watching civilization collapse. Most people expected that the future would be worse than the present. If you were a woman, you faced additional horrors that made survival even more challenging. Pregnancy and childbirth were extremely dangerous, even in good times. During the crisis years, maternal mortality rates were catastrophic. Many women died in childbirth simply because there weren't enough midwives left alive or because malnutrition made pregnancy complications more likely. The few medical practitioners who remained were often more dangerous than helpful, using treatments that increased rather than decreased mortality. Women also faced increased violence as social structures broke down. With legal systems failing and traditional protections absent, domestic violence increased dramatically. Women were often blamed for disasters and became scapegoats for community frustrations. The breakdown of economic systems meant that many traditional female occupations disappeared. The textile industry, which had employed many women, collapsed when trade networks failed. Market systems that had allowed women to sell goods largely disappeared. Women were often left to support families alone when male relatives died, but they had few economic opportunities and little legal protection. Many were forced into prostitution or other dangerous occupations just to survive. If you were a child during this period, your chances of survival were even worse. Child mortality rates, which had been around 30% in normal times, increased to over 50% during the worst plague years. In some regions, it reached 70%. Many children were simply abandoned by parents who couldn't care for them or who were trying to flee the plague. Orphanages, which were run by religious orders, were either overwhelmed or had closed when all the monks and nuns died. Children who survived faced a world where traditional learning systems had broken down. The guild structures that had provided economic opportunities through apprenticeships were devastated. Master craftsmen were dead, workshops were closed, and the knowledge systems that prepared young people for productive lives had largely disappeared. Most child survivors had to learn skills through trial and error, with no systematic way to acquire the knowledge they needed to survive. Many turned to begging, theft, or other desperate measures. Child labor, which had always been common, became even more exploitative as desperate families sent children to work in dangerous conditions. The few schools that remained open had no standardized curriculum and often unqualified teachers. Many children grew up functionally illiterate, unable to access whatever written knowledge had survived the crisis. Education, which had been slowly expanding in the centuries before the plague, essentially disappeared for most of the population. This created a feedback loop of decline that lasted for generations. Without educated populations, societies couldn't maintain the complex knowledge systems needed for technological and cultural advancement. The psychological impact on children was particularly severe. Many had watched their entire families die, had been abandoned by caregivers, had experienced starvation and violence. They grew up in a world where death was commonplace and survival was never guaranteed. These traumatized children became the adults who had to rebuild European civilization. They carried the psychological scars of the crisis into their adult lives, creating societies that were more suspicious, more violent, and less trusting than what had existed before. But somehow, impossibly, they did rebuild. The demographic recovery was slow at first, but it accelerated as conditions improved. By 1400, some regions had stabilized. By 1500, European populations had not only recovered their pre-plague levels, but in many places exceeded them. This recovery wasn't automatic. It required enormous effort and innovation by the survivors. They had to rediscover agricultural techniques, rebuild trade networks, reconstruct social institutions, and recreate the knowledge systems that had been lost. They did this without textbooks, without institutional support, without any of the resources we consider essential for societal development. They rebuilt civilization through trial and error, oral tradition, and sheer determination. The agricultural recovery required completely rethinking farming practices. With so much land abandoned, survivors could choose the best fields and concentrate their efforts on the most productive areas. They developed new crop rotation systems, improved ploughing techniques, and began using water mills more systematically. The labor shortage, which had initially been a disaster, eventually became an advantage. With fewer people competing for resources, those who survived could demand higher wages and better working conditions. This led to the first significant improvement in living standards for ordinary people in centuries. The breakdown of feudal systems, which had seemed catastrophic during the crisis, ultimately created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. Peasants who had survived could sometimes acquire abandoned land. Craftsmen could establish new workshops to replace those that had been lost. Trade networks were rebuilt, but often along different routes and with different centers of power. Cities that had been devastated were sometimes replaced by new commercial centers. The economic geography of Europe was fundamentally reshaped. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the recovery was the intellectual and cultural renaissance that began in the 15th century. The generation that grew up after the plague seemed determined to prove that human civilization could not only survive, but thrive. The printing press was invented, allowing knowledge to be preserved and distributed more effectively than ever before. Universities were refounded and expanded. artistic and architectural achievements reached new heights. The Renaissance, which began in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, can be seen as a direct response to the trauma of the Plague Years. Having watched their civilization nearly collapse, Europeans became obsessed with preserving and advancing human knowledge. The exploration of the New World, which began in the late 15th century, was partially driven by the economic opportunities created by Europe's demographic recovery. With populations growing again, there was demand for new resources and new markets. The scientific revolution that followed was built on foundations laid by plague survivors who were determined to understand the natural world better than their ancestors had. They wanted to make sure that future generations would never again face disasters without the knowledge needed to respond effectively. In many ways, the modern world was created by people who were determined never to repeat the horrors of the 14th century. They built institutions, developed technologies, and created knowledge systems specifically designed to prevent civilizational collapse. But what does this mean for you sitting here in 2025, worried about your problems? It means you're living in a time when humanity has learned from its worst experiences. The institutions that govern our world, imperfect as they are, were designed by people who understood what happens when societies fail. Modern medicine exists because medieval people died of diseases that could have been prevented with basic knowledge. Modern agriculture exists because medieval people starved when agricultural systems failed. Modern communication systems exist because medieval people suffered when communities became isolated. Our social safety nets, our international organizations, our disaster response systems, all of these were created by people who understood what happens when societies don't prepare for crises. Yes, the world has challenges: climate change, political instability, economic uncertainty, social division. These are real problems that deserve serious attention and effort. But you're living in a time when global life expectancy is at an all-time high, when infant mortality rates are the lowest in human history, when literacy rates are approaching 90% worldwide, when we have eradicated diseases that killed millions of our ancestors. You have access to more information than any human in history. You can communicate instantly with people anywhere in the world. You can travel safely across continents. You can access medical care that would have seemed miraculous to medieval people. More importantly, you live in a world where problems can be solved through human cooperation and knowledge. When disasters occur, we have international systems for providing aid. When diseases emerge, we have scientific methods for understanding and treating them. You don't have to face crises alone or without understanding what's causing them. You have access to accumulated human knowledge about how to respond to almost any challenge. Your daily problems, however stressful they feel, are mostly the kinds of problems that people in the 14th century could only dream of having. You're worried about career advancement, not whether you'll starve to death. You're concerned about social relationships, not whether bandits will murder your family. You're anxious about political developments, not whether human civilization will survive at all. This isn't to minimize your struggles. Modern life has its own forms of stress and difficulty: mental health issues, social isolation, economic pressure, environmental concerns. These are real challenges that affect real people. But it's worth remembering that you're living in the most prosperous, peaceful, healthy, and educated period in human history. You have advantages that medieval kings couldn't imagine. You have opportunities that would have been inconceivable to people who lived through the 14th century crisis. Most importantly, you have something that 14th century people often lacked: hope. You live in a time when problems can be solved, when knowledge can be accumulated, when human cooperation can address global challenges. The people who survived the 14th century gave you that hope. They proved that humans can endure almost unimaginable suffering and still rebuild. They showed that even when civilization appears to be ending, human ingenuity and cooperation can create something better from the ruins. You are the descendant of people who lived through the worst time in human history and didn't give up. You carry their resilience, their adaptability, their refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed reasonable. The 14th century survivors rebuilt the world after watching it collapse. They created the foundations for everything you take for granted today. They did this without modern technology, without institutional support, without any guarantee that their efforts would succeed. They rebuilt civilization because they believed their children deserved a better world than the one they had inherited. Every university, every hospital, every system of government that protects you today was created by people who remembered what it was like when these things didn't exist. So the next time you're feeling overwhelmed by modern problems, remember the 14th century. Remember what humans have survived before. Remember that you're living in the best time to be human that has ever existed, built on the sacrifices and struggles of people who faced challenges that make your problems seem manageable by comparison. You are not living through the worst time in human history. You're living through the best time created by people who survived the worst time and were determined to make sure it never happened again. The 14th century was the worst time to have ever been a human. Everything else, including right now, is an improvement. And every improvement was fought for, built and maintained by people who knew exactly how bad things could get and were determined to make them better. But let me get more specific about just how horrific daily existence was during this period, because the abstract numbers don't capture the lived reality of what people endured. Let's talk about food, not just hunger, but what people actually ate when they were desperate enough to eat anything. During the Great Famine, chroniclers recorded people eating cats, dogs, and rats when they could catch them. But when those ran out, they moved to things that weren't technically food at all. Tree bark was stripped, ground up, and mixed with whatever grain could be found to make a kind of bread that provided virtually no nutrition but filled stomachs temporarily. Grass was boiled into soup, not metaphorically. People literally grazed like cattle, pulling up grass and weeds and trying to digest cellulose that human stomachs can't process. This led to severe digestive problems, but it was better than starving immediately. Leather goods were boiled until they became soft enough to chew. Shoes, belts, horse harnesses, anything made of animal hide was potential food. People would boil leather for days to break down the tough fibers, creating a gelatinous mess that provided some protein but often caused intestinal blockages. Human waste was searched for undigested grains. In areas where horses were still alive, horse dung was carefully examined for oats or other grains that had passed through incompletely digested. People fought over access to latrines and manure piles. But perhaps most horrifying were the systematic accounts of cannibalism. This wasn't isolated incidents of desperate individuals. This was organized, market-based human flesh consumption in some regions. Contemporary chronicles from Ireland describe markets where human meat was sold alongside whatever animal flesh could be found. Bodies of plague victims were butchered and their meat sold to people too desperate to care about the source. Fresh corpses were more valuable than those that had been dead for days. Families made decisions about which members to eat first when they died. Children were often chosen because their meat was considered more tender. Elderly family members were sometimes killed specifically to provide food for younger relatives who might survive. Some communities developed rules about cannibalism, determining whose bodies could be consumed and under what circumstances. These weren't savage societies. These were Christian communities with complex moral systems who had been driven to behaviors that violated their deepest beliefs about human dignity. Now let's talk about disease beyond just the plague, because the 14th century was experiencing what we'd now call a disease syndemic. Multiple epidemics occurring simultaneously, each making the others worse. Dysentery, which causes severe diarrhea and dehydration, spread rapidly through malnourished populations. Without modern understanding of hygiene or access to clean water, entire communities would develop dysentery simultaneously. People literally died from dehydration while surrounded by water they couldn't safely drink. Typhus, spread by body lice, thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that plague refugees created when they fled their homes. The disease causes high fever, severe headaches, and a characteristic rash. Most victims died within 2 weeks, but they remained conscious and in agony throughout the process. Ergotism, caused by eating rye infected with a fungus, created symptoms that seemed supernatural to medieval people. Victims experienced hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene in their extremities. Their fingers and toes would turn black and fall off while they remained alive and aware. People thought ergotism was demonic possession because victims would have terrifying visions and speak incoherently. This led to attempts at exorcism that often made the poisoning worse. Entire communities would be affected simultaneously when they ate bread made from contaminated rye. Influenza, which we now consider a relatively minor illness, was often fatal in malnourished populations. People weakened by hunger and other diseases couldn't fight off viral infections that healthy individuals might survive. Influenza outbreaks would sweep through communities already devastated by other diseases. Tuberculosis thrived in overcrowded conditions where people with compromised immune systems lived in close quarters. The disease causes a slow, wasting death over months or years. Victims would cough up blood and gradually waste away while remaining conscious throughout the process. But beyond the major diseases, medieval people faced constant threats from infections that we now prevent with basic hygiene. A simple cut could lead to gangrene and death. Tooth infections could spread to the brain and kill within days. Childbirth injuries almost invariably became infected. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no understanding of how infections spread or how to prevent them. Surgery was performed with dirty instruments by practitioners who had no training in sterile techniques. Most surgical patients died not from the original injury but from post-operative infections. Medical treatments often made conditions worse. Bloodletting, which was prescribed for almost every ailment, weakened patients who needed all their strength to fight disease. Purging with powerful laxatives caused dangerous dehydration. Trepanning, drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits, often caused fatal brain infections. The few hospitals that existed were run by religious orders and were essentially places where people went to die. They had no effective treatments and often served as centers of disease transmission rather than healing. Let's talk about violence, which was endemic during this period in ways that go far beyond normal medieval warfare. With legal systems collapsed and traditional authorities dead or fled, communities were left to police themselves. This led to cycles of revenge violence that could destroy entire regions. A dispute over food resources between two families could escalate into feuds that lasted generations and killed hundreds of people. Mercenary companies, professional soldiers who had been employed by now dead nobles, roamed the countryside as essentially organized crime syndicates. These weren't individual bandits. These were military units with sophisticated equipment and tactics, preying on defenseless civilian populations. The 100 Years' War was raging during this period, but much of the violence wasn't organized warfare between armies. It was systematic terror campaigns against civilian populations. Soldiers would deliberately target non-combatants, burning crops, destroying mills, and killing livestock to starve enemy territories into submission. Free companies, mercenary groups that served whoever could pay them, would sometimes capture entire towns and hold them for ransom. If the ransom wasn't paid, they would systematically torture and kill the inhabitants as an example to other communities. Sexual violence was widespread and systematic. Women and children were targeted not just opportunistically, but as a deliberate strategy to demoralize enemy populations. Rape was so common that it was barely remarked upon in contemporary chronicles, except when it occurred on an unusually large scale. Domestic violence increased as traditional social constraints broke down. Men who had lost their economic status, their social roles, and their sense of control often turned their frustration on family members. With no functioning legal system to provide protection, domestic abuse often escalated to murder. Child abuse became more common as adults, traumatized by constant exposure to death and violence, lost the capacity for normal emotional relationships. Children were beaten, abandoned, or sold into slavery by parents who couldn't cope with the stress of survival. The psychological impact of constant violence created communities where aggression was normalized. People who had watched their neighbors torture and kill each other became inured to suffering. Violence became a first resort rather than a last resort for resolving disputes. Let's talk about the breakdown of basic infrastructure in more detail, because this affected every aspect of daily life. Roads, which had been maintained by local authorities and guilds, became impassable when there was no one left to repair them. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt. What had been a network of safe, maintained travel routes became dangerous wilderness paths. This isolation had cascading effects. Communities that had depended on trade for essential goods couldn't obtain them. Salt, which was necessary for food preservation, became unavailable in inland areas. Iron tools couldn't be replaced when local blacksmiths died. Seeds for planting couldn't be obtained from other regions. Water systems failed catastrophically. The mills that ground grain were water-powered, and when the millwrights died, entire regions lost the ability to process grain into flour. Even when grain was available, people couldn't turn it into bread without functioning mills. Irrigation systems that had taken centuries to build fell into disrepair within years. Fields that had been productive for generations became swamps or deserts when drainage systems weren't maintained. Agricultural knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries was lost when the people who possessed it died. Buildings collapsed from neglect. Without constant maintenance, medieval timber and stone construction deteriorated rapidly. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, foundations shifted. People were literally living in ruins of their former civilization. The monetary system collapsed in many regions. Coins became worthless when there wasn't enough economic activity to support currency exchange. People reverted to barter systems, but even those broke down when there weren't enough goods being produced to trade. Legal systems that had taken centuries to develop disappeared overnight. Property rights, contracts, criminal justice, all of the institutional frameworks that allowed complex societies to function simply vanished when there weren't enough people left to maintain them. Communication networks failed. The system of messengers and traveling merchants who had carried information between communities disappeared. Regions that had been connected to wider European networks of knowledge and trade became completely isolated. But perhaps most importantly, let's talk about what this period did to human relationships and social bonds. Trust, which is essential for any functioning society, essentially disappeared. When survival was uncertain and resources were scarce, everyone became a potential threat. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for generations turned on each other when food became scarce. Marriage and family relationships broke down under the pressure. Men abandoned pregnant wives rather than take on the burden of additional mouths to feed. Parents abandoned children they couldn't support. Children fled from parents who had become violent or unstable. The concept of hospitality, which had been central to medieval culture, disappeared. Travelers were no longer welcomed as guests, but were seen as threats who might bring disease or compete for scarce resources. Communities became closed and suspicious of outsiders. Social institutions that had provided stability collapsed. Guilds, which had regulated trades and provided social support for craftsmen, disbanded when most of their members died. Religious confraternities, which had provided community support networks, ceased to function when there weren't enough surviving members. The extended family networks that had been the foundation of medieval society were destroyed. When plague killed 50 to 60% of the population, most families were completely wiped out. The social knowledge of how to maintain family relationships across generations was lost. Children grew up without proper socialization. Many were raised by traumatized adults or by other children. They never learned the social skills necessary for maintaining stable relationships or participating in complex social institutions. Communities that had existed for centuries simply ceased to exist. Not just the physical settlements, but the social relationships, shared traditions, and collective knowledge that had made them communities rather than just collections of buildings. The breakdown of social bonds created what sociologists would now recognize as widespread social pathology. People became suspicious, aggressive, and unable to cooperate even when cooperation would benefit everyone. The social skills necessary for maintaining civilization had to be relearned from scratch. Let me paint an even more detailed picture of what a single day would have been like for a survivor in 1349. You wake before dawn in a single room that you share with whoever else in your family is still alive. Maybe that's your spouse and one surviving child. Maybe it's just a sibling or cousin. Maybe you're completely alone in what used to be a family home. The first thing you do is listen. Are there any sounds from outside that indicate danger? Voices that might belong to bandits or soldiers? Animals that might indicate the presence of strangers? In a world where your neighbors might kill you for your food, every sound is potentially threatening. You check your limited food supplies. Maybe you have a few handfuls of grain left, some dried meat that's probably starting to rot, a bit of cheese that's more mold than cheese. You calculate how long these supplies will last and whether it's worth eating anything today or saving it for tomorrow. You check on other family members. Is anyone showing signs of illness? Fever could mean plague. A rash could mean typhus. Stomach problems could mean dysentery. Any symptom could be a death sentence, and there's nothing you can do about it except hope. If everyone seems healthy, you face the question of what to do with the day. Should you try to find food? Should you work on repairs to your shelter? Should you try to travel to another community that might have resources? Every decision is potentially fatal. Leaving your shelter exposes you to bandits, disease, and starvation. Staying put means slowly using up your resources without replacing them. There are no good choices. If you decide to look for food, you might search through abandoned houses for anything edible that previous scavengers missed. You might try to trap rats or birds. You might dig for roots or search for edible plants, though most of the easily accessible food sources have already been exhausted. You have to be constantly alert for threats. Other scavengers who might compete with you for resources or simply kill you to eliminate competition. Wild animals that have moved into abandoned areas. Roving bands of desperate people who have turned to violence as a survival strategy. If you find food, you face the problem of getting it safely back to your shelter without being robbed. You might have to hide your discoveries and return for them later. You might have to fight other people who want what you found. Back at your shelter, you face the daily struggle of staying warm, staying clean enough to avoid disease, and maintaining whatever tools or possessions you still have. Every item is precious because replacements are unavailable. You might spend time trying to repair clothes that are falling apart, using whatever materials you can scavenge. You might work on improving your shelter's defenses against both weather and human threats. You might try to preserve whatever food you found. As evening approaches, you face the question of whether to light a fire. Fire provides warmth and allows you to cook food, but it also signals your presence to anyone nearby. It might attract people who want to share your fire and food, or it might attract people who want to kill you and take everything you have. You go to sleep hungry, cold, and afraid. You listen to every sound, wondering if this will be the night someone breaks into your shelter. You wonder if you'll wake up sick, if today's exertion in searching for food has exposed you to disease. You dream, when you can sleep at all, about the world that existed before everything collapsed, about having enough food, about feeling safe, about the people you've lost. You wake up and for a moment forget where you are, then remember that the nightmare is real. This wasn't just happening to a few unlucky individuals. This was the daily reality for millions of people across Europe for decades. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but crisis, violence, and struggle for survival. And yet somehow, impossibly, enough people survived to rebuild. The recovery didn't happen quickly or easily. It took generations of sustained effort by people who had every reason to give up but chose not to. Agricultural recovery required not just replanting fields, but rediscovering techniques that had been lost when experienced farmers died. Survivors had to experiment with crop rotations, soil management, and seasonal timing. Many of these experiments failed, leading to additional famines and setbacks. Rebuilding trade networks required establishing trust between communities that had become suspicious and isolated. Merchants had to convince people to trade valuable goods with strangers when everyone had learned that strangers often meant danger. Reconstructing governments required creating new institutions when the old ones had completely collapsed. Survivors had to develop new forms of law enforcement, new systems of taxation, new methods of administering justice. Most of these early attempts failed and had to be tried again. Restoring religious institutions required rebuilding not just churches and monasteries, but the faith that had been shattered by the church's failure to protect people during the crisis. Many people had lost trust in traditional Christianity and had to be convinced to participate in religious life again. Educational systems had to be created from nothing. The schools, universities, and apprenticeship programs that had transmitted knowledge for centuries were gone. Survivors had to develop new ways of teaching essential skills to children who had grown up without formal education. But perhaps most challenging was rebuilding the social trust that allows complex societies to function. People who had learned that neighbors could become enemies had to relearn how to cooperate. Communities that had become closed and suspicious had to open themselves to trade and interaction with outsiders. This process took centuries. Some regions didn't fully recover until the Renaissance. Others never returned to their pre-plague levels of population and prosperity. But the survivors did more than just restore what had been lost. They created innovations that made European society more resilient and more prosperous than it had been before the crisis. The labor shortage created by demographic collapse led to technological innovations designed to replace human workers. Water mills and windmills became more sophisticated and more widely used. Agricultural techniques were improved to allow smaller numbers of workers to produce more food. The breakdown of feudal systems created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. Peasants could acquire abandoned land and become independent farmers. Craftsmen could establish workshops in depopulated cities where competition was reduced. The failure of traditional institutions led to new forms of organization that were more flexible and more responsive to changing conditions. City-states developed new forms of government. Trading companies created new forms of commercial organization. The trauma of the crisis led to new forms of cultural expression that were more realistic and more psychologically sophisticated than what had existed before. art, literature, and music began to address human suffering and complexity in ways that earlier medieval culture had avoided. The medical failures of the plague years led to new interest in understanding disease and developing better treatments. While medieval medicine remained primitive by modern standards, the post-plague period saw increased attention to observation and experimentation. The breakdown of religious authority led to new forms of spirituality that were more personal and more questioning than traditional medieval Christianity. These developments would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation and the development of modern religious thought. But most importantly, the people who survived the 14th century crisis learned lessons about resilience, cooperation, and adaptation that shaped European development for centuries afterward. They learned that civilizations could collapse, but could also be rebuilt. They learned that human cooperation was essential for survival, but that it required conscious effort and institutional support. They learned that knowledge and skills could be lost, but could also be recovered through systematic effort. These lessons informed the development of the modern world. The institutions we rely on today, the social systems that provide security and opportunity, the knowledge systems that allow us to understand and respond to crises, all of these were created by people who understood what happens when societies fail to prepare for disaster. So, when you're sitting in your comfortable home, reading this on a device that connects you instantly to all of human knowledge, eating food that was grown thousands of miles away and transported to you through global supply chains, protected by medical systems that can cure diseases that would have killed medieval people within days, you're experiencing the culmination of 700 years of determined effort to make sure that the 14th century never happens again. Every convenience you take for granted was created by people who understood suffering in ways we can barely imagine. Every institution that protects you was designed by people who had seen what happens when protective institutions fail. You live in a world that represents the greatest sustained effort in human history to eliminate the conditions that made the 14th century possible. And that effort has been remarkably successful. That's the legacy you've inherited. That's the world you get to live in. And that's why, no matter how difficult your problems seem, you have reasons for hope that medieval people could never have imagined.